Welcome to Rejebian. I hate to disappoint everybody. David is out tonight, and I haven't had a joke in me for my entire lifetime. So I'm not gonna get anybody warmed up on anything. But I will say, and it was kind of inadvertent. You may have noticed we are doing murder and mayhem this summer. I mean, literally. Well, between jewel thieves and black widows and Bonnie and Clyde, and today, murder mysteries of Agatha Christie. It just worked out that way. I don't think that's the way probably the clergy staff at this church have envisioned things happening in this hall. So I would ask you not to tell them that if you see them. But it's been fun. So anyway, welcome to Rejebian. I want to introduce a great member of our staff, Petrella Booker, to welcome on behalf of the church and pray.
Can we give Richard a hand clap of praise? Hey, man, yeah. All right, there's your joke right there. Amen. Will you please bow your head with me? Lord, we gather here today with hearts brimming with gratitude for Highland Park United Methodist Church and 68 seasons of the Rejebian series, which enrich our lives. We thank you for the written words that transport us to new worlds, inspire our minds, and touch our hearts and souls. As we listen to the book review this evening, we are grateful for the freedom to read, which is essential to our democracy. We express our deepest appreciation for the opportunity to gather as a community, united by our love for literature. Bless the Rejebian series and Highland Park United Methodist Church. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. And now I have the lovely Nancy. Oh.
Nice to have help to get up those steps. Well, I'm Nancy Turner, and we're so glad to have all of you here. Gosh, this is just a great group, Mary. I am a member of Highland Park Methodist Church. I'm a member of the Rejebian Committee, and we're so glad to have all of you here. Most of all, I'm so glad to have Mary here. Shall we step up here a little bit closer?
Oh, wow, the lights are on.
Yeah, the lights are on, that's right. Mary, to start off, tell us why you decided to give book reviews.
Well, I never decided to give book reviews. My dean told me to go to the emeritus office. They needed me, so I did. And what they wanted was for me to go to retirement communities and do reviews or any kind of talk I wanted to do because they needed stuff for their residents. And I thought, well, that sounds like fun. And I just happened to be working on some things I thought would be interesting, like Ben Franklin and our early fathers. And so I did. And every time I went to a retirement community and spoke to a group, somebody would come up at the end and say, would you come do that for our book review club? And I'm going, oh, sure. And then I had to figure out exactly what a book review club was going to look like in terms of my lecture series. And all of a sudden, here I am. And it's been fun.
Great. Well, the second question is, I know you have another life besides book reviews. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. I know there's a bunch of people in this audience that have done a lot of volunteering in your life. And I did all of that with schools and churches and hospitals and art museums during my regular life. But then I retired, and that opened up a whole new world. And besides that, my doctor told me I needed to get out of the heat of Dallas and the ozone for at least 2 weeks and preferably 2 months every summer. So I had to find a way to do that put me with other people. You can't just travel for 2 months solo and get to know people. And I found some of the best things. You won't believe they don't pay you. But if you volunteer a certain number of hours, they give you room and board. And I got to go to Washington State, to Fort Spokane for 6 weeks. It was incredible. That's where I got to be a part of the team that would dismantle, move, and reassemble a Civil War era mountain cannon. I bet none of you have had a chance to do that, have you? I didn't think so. The other thing that I did was I worked at a church conference center in North Carolina, and that was a lot of fun. I got to do laundry. I got to do weeding the garden. There were but the fun part was I ran the Starbucks on campus. I was a barista. I mean, it's amazing the things you learn when you've got extra time on your hands. And then the last, and it was not getting out of the heat in Dallas, I became a Texas Baptist man. Well, actually, I became a woman working with a Texas Baptist man. And they do disaster relief. And they have all kinds of things. When you tell somebody you worked with a disaster relief, they want to know, did you work on the chainsaw gang? And no, I didn't. Again, I did laundry. I cooked. I took care of children. I passed out cardboard boxes. My very first call out was Hurricane Dolly down in the McAllen area. And these people had lost everything in the floods that followed them. So it was amazing. We were feeding 10,000 people a day. That's a lot of cans of food to open up and heat and get ready. So it takes a lot of people. So there are lots of jobs that are out there if you've got the time. And I will tell you, I have found every volunteer thing I have ever done, I gained more from the effort than the people I was trying to help. It was always such a blessing to be able to be there and be the assistance they needed.
Okay, that's great. That's great. Mm-hmm. Great. Well, one more question. Tell me about your family. We always like to know that. And then we're going to have this wonderful book review.
Okay. I am blessed to have 3 grown sons. One of them helped me up on the stage a minute ago. He doesn't want me to break anything.
I think he helped me too.
He did. He was the...
Don't know why.
And tonight I have 2 of my grandchildren. I have 8 grandchildren. And I have three great-grandchildren. One of them is a little person about 11 months old now, and the other 2 are in elementary school. But the big ones are all out of college now, except there are 3 of the younger ones. They're getting close, but they are still, it's fantastic to have the opportunity to watch your children raise their children and then become grandparents with their children. And I feel really blessed that God gave me 3 boys, because I don't know what I'd do with a girl.
Well, let's give her a big hand.
Mm-hmm.
We're glad to have you. All right.
Thank you, Nancy. Okay. Wow. This is a good group for a Wednesday night in the middle of summer in Dallas, because some of you like to get out of town as much as I do. We're going to be looking at, I hope we're going to be looking at, we are going to be looking at, you never know with technology. We're going to be looking at 2 books today. One is The Science of Murder, and it's the forensic science of Agatha Christie novels. And this is written by Carla Valentine, and she's a pretty interesting woman in herself. The other book that she refers to when she wrote The Science of Murder was Agatha Christie's autobiography. And when you look at her autobiography, you see how these things all fit together. Now, we're gonna talk a little bit about Sarah Valentine, and then through the rest of the presentation, I will bring up things that she has researched and put together, but I won't always call that she had done it. This is Carla. She's an anatomical pathology technologist. That means she was a coroner. And she did a lot of autopsies before she began to write books and also study other things. I love the red hair. It tells you a little bit about her personality. And the skull that she's holding, she calls herself the chick in the dead. because she does a lot of work with dead people. Some of the books that she wrote before this one were Past Mortems and Murder Isn't Easy. One of her jobs, and I didn't realize, every major hospital in England has a coroner on the staff. And anytime an unexplained death happens, they have to do an autopsy. And so she was doing a lot of autopsies, and she became very interested in excavating the plague graves in Venice and the World War II mass graves in Belgium. They were trying to find some explanation for how the World War II people had died and identify them to give families some closure. And in the plague graves, they were trying to find out exactly what had killed these people and try to find ways to take care of them. She also assists in dissection of donated cadavers for medical students. I got to work at a medical school once. I was a histology technician, and one of my jobs was sitting in the room with the cadavers when the students were taking the test. So I know exactly what she marked on those cadavers. It was an interesting job. She's also now a curator of Bart's Pathology Museum, and this is a place where you can go and study all kinds of forensic science. You can study the trajectory of bullets. You can study what happens when a bullet hits the head, when it hits it from the front to the back or the back to the front. Is it different? Yes, it is. There are all kinds of things in that area that she worked in. She was very, very interested in Agatha Christie. She loved her books, had started reading her books when she was in elementary school, read all of them, and was impressed and amazed that Agatha Christie was one of the first ones that included the new science in her stories. She would bring to the forefront all of the new technology that was coming into being at this time. This was called a golden era of mystery and of murder, because they are learning so much about the science and how to use it to identify the killers. They are learning so much about the different weapons. And so it's a time when the authors work, in fact, with the police and with other specialists to be certain that the things they put in their books are correct. You've probably heard of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes. He was in the same club that Agatha was in, and they had members from Scotland Yard, from all over, that contributed to these monthly meetings. And then the writers would put it in their material so that the public became more aware of what was going on. She is going to be the most commercially successful novelist ever, outsold only by the Bible and Shakespeare. That's kind of high cotton. She also wrote a play called The Mousetrap that ran, its longest running play, ran 67 years. We'll talk a little more about that and when it ended. Between 1920 and 1976, she published over 102 books in over 100 languages. That's over 2 books a year. I can hardly write a letter that often. The 2 billion copies have been sold. You can imagine what a demand it would be. Well, let's look at some of the books that she wrote and the kinds of things that she did. Hercule Poirot was one of her main characters, and he's going to appear in 33 novels, 2 plays, and 50 short stories. Now, those short stories are important because if you watch on PBS, you know they have that Agatha Christie series about Poirot. Those were based on short stories of hers. Most of the movies are based on novels, but most of the TV program are on short stories. Miss Marple was her second most popular character. She's in 12 novels and 20 short stories. Tommy and Tuppence, a couple, appear in four volumes and 1 short story collection. Overall, there's 65 short stories in 14 volumes. That means they've got a lot that they haven't used yet, so we could still have some new Agatha Christie stuff in the future. 27 plays, including The Mousetrap, that ran for over, from 52 to 21. Now, the only reason The trap closed in London was because of the pandemic. And once the pandemic was over, it has reopened there and is continuing its run. There was talk last year of bringing it to Broadway, but they have decided that, well, at this point, it hasn't happened, and I don't know when it will happen. She wrote 3 nonfiction books, and most people are not familiar with those. But those tended to be books about the years that she spent with her second husband exploring the archaeological digs and working with them. She became very important in those digs. She was good at photography, getting the pictures of the finds, helping to clean the different specimens that they would find, so that these 3 nonfiction books, 2 of them were about the archaeological digs. The third one was about her train travel and how much she liked traveling. And that sounds like such a normal thing to do. But at this time, she was doing this travel after her divorce and before her second marriage by herself. Her daughter was in boarding school, and so she was doing on the Orient Express and all of these really exotic trains by herself, and that was kind of unheard of at that time, but it gave her a lot of material for books, that's for sure. She wrote 2 books of poetry, 6 romance novels. Most people don't know she wrote romance novels. She wrote them under the name Mary Westmacott, and they were pretty good. I read 3 of them before I ever knew she had written them, and I was really excited about this new author, and then I found out, well, it's not a new author, but I'll still read her books. And she wrote 1 children's book, Star Over Bethlehem. We got to know Agatha to understand how she had this great wealth of stories to write. She's born Agatha Miller in 1890 in Devon, UK. She was the 3rd child for the Miller family, a lot younger than the others. Now, at this point, most of this level of society in England send their children off to boarding school when they're 8 years old. So when she's born, her next sibling is 12 years older than she is, so they're already off at boarding school. So she's basically an only child. And her mother has changed her mind about her parenting style. You see, she sent the others off. They did really well. They learned well. They're successful in their lives. But she feels like it would crush the creativity in little Agatha if she had a governess or she sent her to school. So she did have a governess to take care of her because, I mean, her folks are older. They've got other things to do. And her mother had told the governess, do not teach Agatha to read until she's 8 years old. I don't want her losing her creativity by reading and not coming up with her own ideas. Well, you can imagine the terror that struck that governess when she realized that 4-year-old Agatha had taught herself to read. She was shaking in her boots trying to explain to Miss Miller why I didn't do it. I didn't teach her. She did it all by herself. Now, she's all by herself as an only child because of the difference in age. So every night she would do something to entertain her parents after dinner. She would make up stories and plays. And these 2 little dolls, who obviously are much loved, look at that straggly hair, they became her characters. And they would do the speaking parts for the plays that she did for her parents at night. So she never really had a formal education. Oh, her mother and her sister taught her basic math, expanded her reading some, taught her a little bit of common science, but she really never had formal education as such. She had a very, very loving childhood. Her parents were adoring. The relationship with both her mother and her father could not have been better until her father died suddenly. This is going to change their lives because her mother did not know that her father had basically spent most of the family fortune. And when he died, she is presented with the fact that you have the house you live in, it's free and clear. You have a trust fund that will give you basic needs, but that's basically all you have. Well, that wasn't going to work. Agatha is almost to the age where she is going to be presented to society. She's going to be looking for a husband. And now it's urgent that she finds a husband with some money. So her mother does what a lot of widows in England at this time are doing. She leases out the house, and she takes the money from the lease, and she and Agatha travel. And they go lots of places around the world, but one of the best is Egypt. And there's this huge group of expatriates from England that are in Egypt, so that when you look at pictures of that time, you would not know they weren't in England somewhere. There is a picture of a Sphinx in there, so that they do know that they're not in England. But most everything looks just like they transplanted England into that part of Egypt. And she was presented as a debutante in Egypt during that year. And it was a very successful time. And then her mother decided, well, she hadn't really found anybody that's sparking anything, so let's try another fishing area. And they went to Paris. And this is when she went to her only formal education was in Paris. She's about 20 years old at this point, and she goes to finishing school. She's going to learn to play the piano. She's going to learn to sing. She's going to learn about literature and languages and all of those things that are so important in life. And she gets so good on the piano and with the voice that she decides she's going to become a professional performer. She's going to sing with symphonies. She's going to play with, and then all of a sudden she realized that there were a lot of other people at that school that were every bit as good as she was. So she decided she would play for the family whenever they wanted to be entertained. But that time in Paris was a good time for her and her mother. Then World War II starts up and everything changes. Like many homes in that part of England, in Devon, it's going to become a convalescent home. And they're going to need lots of nursing care for these young men that are coming back from Europe with major war injuries, and they need nurses to take care of them. These young women have not trained as nurses. They have no idea of the responsibility. They have no idea about how to take care of an open wound, there are just so many things that they've never experienced that they are now experiencing. And this is strictly a volunteer situation. But it changes for Agatha because they approach the nurses and they say, we are desperate for a pharmacist. We need a pharmacist in every facility, and we don't have enough. We will train you, and we will pay you if you will train to be a pharmacist. Agatha could not believe her good fortune. Number one, she wanted to know more about all those drugs and what they do and how they can be positive effects or negative effects. So she is going to train and become a pharmacist. And oh my goodness, can you imagine how many plot lines she got? The wealth of mystery plots and details was overwhelming. She will fill this role as a pharmacist both in World War I and in World War II. Now, she's still looking for a husband, and her mother thinks they found one. It's like the neighbor down the road. His family has been a close friend of their family for years. The kids have known each other since they were children. They are good friends. And so they decide they will get engaged. And it makes the mother so happy. But then something happened that changed everything. She met Archibald Christie. He was different than anything she had ever met before. Number one, he rode one hot motorcycle, and she could ride behind him. That was a really unique thing for her. But he was planning on being a pilot. Well, he was a pilot. He was training as a pilot. And he was very concerned because a lot of pilots were getting killed, particularly in World War I. And so he did not want to leave a widow or a widow with children. So he has told Agatha that they cannot marry until after the war. And that's okay. She's doing her work in the pharmacy. He's doing his thing. And then he gets sick. And he gets one of those illnesses that had the really high fever that sometimes affects eyesight. And it affected his eyesight. And he was no longer qualified to fly. And this was devastating to Archie. And Archie's not one of those people that takes change or the loss of something he wants so badly very well. He just couldn't deal with that. So he's on leave in December of 1914, comes to Agatha's house. They spend a few days with her mother, and now they're going to train, headed to London to spend some time with his parents. And Archie announces that he thinks they need to get married the next day. He's got it all arranged. We're going to go down to the Justice of the Peace. It'll all be done. And I want you to look at this picture. Now, I may be a little prejudiced about Archie, but really, do you love the bouquet of flowers he got her on her wedding day? And by the way, her wedding dress is really unique, isn't it? Archie was very self-centered, and that does not change. But that was okay with Agatha. She was head over heels in love with him, and her mother had taught her that a woman's role in life was to make her husband happy, and she is going to work very hard to try to do that. Now, they'd only been married a couple of years when Archie, the war is over, and he is going to be traveling with the British Empire mission. He's going to be one of the directors, and it's an incredible opportunity. They are going to travel all around the world. They're going to go to Australia, to Africa, to Canada, everywhere, and she has a chance to go with him. There's only one hitch. They have a baby girl. She's about 2 at this point, and there's no place on this mission for little girls. So they're going to leave their little girl with her mother and her sister and be gone for 10 months. Now, I put a few pictures in here of the adventures she has because these will show up later in some of her books and stories. She's the first female Western woman to stand up on a surfboard. It was documented in Cape Town in South Africa in 22 and then later in Hawaii. And the board that's in that picture there is a curved board at the front. That she was real excited about that because the first boards that she tried to surf on were squared across the top, and they do not go well into the waves. So she was real excited when she got this board. Now, 1920, things are going to begin to change. Archie is making decent money. He's just not able to keep up the living style that she had grown up with. So her sister is telling her that she needs to write a book. She writes these wonderful stories and sells some of them to magazines and newspapers. And you ought to write a book. And she said, oh, goodness, no, I could never do that. No, a book is just above me. And her sister kept pushing at it, and finally her sister dropped, I double dog dare you. Well, we all know if you double dog dare, you got to do it. And so she wrote The Mysterious Affair at Styles. It was published in 1920, and it was more successful than they expected. It really did well. Now, this is the first time we meet Poirot, and I was so tickled in her autobiography to find out how in the world she came up with this character. In the first place, his name was supposed to be Hercules. I hear a few laughter, yes. When she started out, Hercules seemed like a good name for him. And as she wrote more and more of the book, she realized this was not a Hercules. So she changed it to Hercule. Never heard of that name before, but it worked for her. Now, Hercule Poirot. Where did she come up with the last name? It's a Belgian name, just as he refers to in the novels all the time. She had worked with Belgian refugees during the war. So she had become familiar with many of their habits and their names, and that's where she got that name put together. I'm glad I finally know how to pronounce his first name. This book also introduces the murder bag. Up until this time, we've not had any organized work at the crime scene to get the clues and the information they need documented early on. This is going to begin a change in the way that they investigate murders, and that murder bag will come back later, but right now it is being introduced in her 1920 book, The Mysterious Affairs at Styles. And by the way, that Mysterious Affairs at Styles made enough money she could buy a house that was much nicer than what they had been living in, and she bought a car. It was really nice to have her own money. Agatha and her daughter Rosalind. Rosalind was born in 1919, and this is another thing her mother had insisted that it was important that the child bond with their father. The mother was responsible for all of these everyday things, but the father would, and sure enough, Rosalind was a daddy's girl. They were very close. She had a good relationship with her mother, but she was definitely a daddy's girl, and that was fine with Agatha. That meant that she was doing her job if she was attached to her father. Now, things are moving along. She's writing more books. Everything is getting better, except their marriage isn't. It's kind of fallen apart. And so she is, and the other thing that was going on at that time, her mother has died. Her sister is not able to come and help her close up the house. She's trying to get everything organized from her mother's estate. And she's just overwhelmed with all that's going on. So there's two things that happen. One, she consults doctors about the depression and how overwhelming it was. And two, she talks to Archie and talks him into coming home for a long weekend. Just the two of them will go somewhere and have some time to try to rebuild their relationship. So that's what's supposed to be happening when he comes home that afternoon. He doesn't even bring the luggage into the house. He stops at the front door and basically, and I'm making this up because I wasn't there, basically he says, I've fallen in love with another woman. We're getting married. Our engagement's being announced tonight. You need to get a divorce. She kind of went into a real stupor. I mean, can you imagine you're thinking you're going away for a romantic weekend and he's announcing his engagement to another woman? And it happened to be at friends' houses, and she knew nothing about it. He went off to announce his engagement. She was not found for the 11 days. The next morning when they got up, nobody could find Agatha. They could find no sign of her. Then they found the car. It was near a chalk quarry. The thing is, it was not just near it. There were a couple of little shrubs, and the car was right up to the shrubs. If she got out of that car on the wrong side and turned the wrong way, she would have stepped right off into that chalk pit, quarry, and drowned. Hopefully, she had turned the other way. Her clothes and license were still in the car, so they had no clue where she might be. So they immediately start searching the quarry and the land around. And for 11 days, it is on the front page of every newspaper. And people are really relating to her because now her 6th book has just been published. She's an author they know and relate to. And they're searching everywhere for her. Some people are getting upset because they think it might be a promotional thing for that 6th book. And so they are concerned that that's happened. Finally, on the 11th day, she's found at a hotel spa in Harrogate. She's registered as Teresa Neely. Now, I just love this. She does not know who she is or where she is, but she did remember enough to register in the name of her husband's new fiancé. Don't you love it? Now, the woman's name wasn't Teresa, but it was Neely. And everybody knew immediately why Neely was on there. They did take her to multiple doctors. They did try. Several of the doctors said that she was in what they were calling a fugue state, where her life had gotten so bad that she could not face it, so she just took another life and put it together. And so it will be a while of working with doctors before she recovers. Most people will tell you that she never spoke publicly about that 11 days and what happened. That's not quite true. A couple of years after it happened, the divorce is coming up. She is fighting for custody of Rosalind. And the Daily Mirror, which is one of the newspapers that had carried so much coverage on her disappearance, is going to interview her, and she will answer as truthfully as she can. And she even says then, there are parts of it I do not know. But nobody remembers that because there was a big story on the front page, so it was put back in the back somewhere. And most people didn't even know she had had that interview, but it is recorded. Her 6th book that had just come out was The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, and it did sell very well in spite of this. Now, it's kind of interesting that this far after these events, they're still writing books about what happened. The Mystery of Mrs. Christie, and somebody at one of my book reviews came up and told me I needed to get this one before I ever started doing the Agatha Christie review. She said, you just won't believe all the things they know. Well, this Mystery of Mrs. Christie is a fascinating read, but it is pure fiction. And the other book, Agatha Christie and the 11 Missing Days, was re-released in 2011. This is decades after this happened, but these are still best-selling books because so many people are interested in what happened at that period. Go forward a little bit. Most times, after a divorce or a death in the family or something, and you're left to start a new life, you might want to just take an inventory of what is going on and what her strengths are and what her weaknesses are. So she made some lists, and I just chose my favorite things. She's not good at games. Never she'll be a good conversationalist. Can't draw, paint, or do any kind of sculpture. Can't hurry without getting rattled. Can't say what I mean easily. Can write it better. I think almost any of us could find that list appropriate. Those are not necessarily problems. The things I can do is the list that I really love, though, because it shows you a different side of Agatha. I can write. Yeah, we know that. Reasonable musician, can accompany singers. Can improvise things when in difficulty. For instance, she took a hairpin and some bread that she had mashed up till it was real sticky and put it on the hairpin and sealed it with sealing wax on the end of a window pole and stuck it out the window and reached down and stuck it onto her mother's false teeth and pulled them up. Where in the world did she get that idea? Oh, but the next one's even better. She successfully chloroformed a hedgehog that was entangled in the tennis net. They're out playing tennis, having a great time, and this poor little hedgehog wasn't paying attention and just ran across the court, and a ball just almost hit him, and he jumped onto the net and got tangled. And the more they tried to disengage that little hedgehog, the worse it was. So she just goes in the house and gets some chloroform and just chloroforms that little baby till he's sound asleep. She takes him apart and puts him back in the woods where he can go off by himself. Now, I'm impressed, but I'm also curious, why did she have chloroform in the house? And she's also useful around the house. And we know that because at one point, when they didn't have enough money to hire a nanny for Rosalind and a maid for them, they hired the nanny for Rosalind, and Agatha was the maid. So we know she can keep house and do a good job of it. Now, she's going to travel all over the world, and friends are so wonderful to her during this time period. And they're going to invite her to visit them in different homes around the world. And this is Leonard Woolery and his wife are going to invite her to Syria in the 1930s to see what they're doing on this archaeological dig. And it's a very successful dig. And so she is learning all kinds of stuff about it. And this young man named Max Malawan has been assigned by Leonard to show her around, take her to some neighboring digs, and get to understand the atmosphere in this world of archaeology. Now, one of Max's assignments was to take her to other digs. And so they are going to another dig, and the car breaks down. Now, they're in the middle of a desert, and I don't know about you, but I'd sort of panic about that. I'm stuck. I don't even know where I am. So Max and the chauffeur are going to be working on it to get it restored, and Max looked over, and here is Agatha. She has spread her coat out on the sand in the shade of the car, and she is taking a nap. And he makes a note in his diary that night, "This is a woman I want to know better." And he did. They got married in 1931. This is them celebrating their marriage aboard a Nile steamer in Egypt. and they are going to live a very happy life and a fairly long life together. She is going to become his helper on the digs. He is also a writer. They will both be recognized for their work. He will be knighted. She will become a dame of the British Empire. It is amazing how their two lives merge so beautifully. Did I mention that he was 15 years younger than she was? That was just one little thing. People used to ask her about that and being married to an archaeologist, and she had this wonderful answer. An archaeologist is the perfect husband. The older you get, the more interesting you are. The two of them were very supportive of each other's careers, and he loved it that she did so much research to be sure her novels were up to date. In fact, he often cited this one situation where a solicitor contacted her about a book she had written and said, "Madam, you need to do more research on the inheritance laws in this country. You misjudged in this book on page so-and-so." She sat down and wrote him a letter and said, "Sir, I believe you might be the one that needs to do more research on the inheritance laws. The law you quoted was replaced by the law I quoted 2 years ago." It just pleased Max no end that she was always on top of what she was doing and did lots of research. Now, we have our two characters. Let's get into the forensics. Forensic is relating to or denoting the application of scientific methods and techniques to the investigation of crime. It also relates to the courts of law. More recently, any careful investigation or in-depth analysis is forensic. For instance, I know you've heard of forensic accounting or accountants that prepare things for court. And this is the kind of thing that we're going to be looking at. And Sarah Valentine has found examples of places in her novels where she would be ahead of the curve in putting this into the public atmosphere. One of the people that is doing incredible work at this time is a Dr. Lecard, and he establishes the first police lab in Lyon, France in 1910. Now, Dr. Lecard's exchange principle of forensic science is one that's still used, and it changed the way that people looked at the murder scenes or the area where a crime happened. And one of his exchange principle is that every contact leaves a trace. And the other half of that is if you bring something in to a scene or an area, when you leave, you're going to take something out too. So you may incriminate yourself with carpet fibers that you pick up on your shoes before you leave. Or you may leave something from your footprint on the floor when you're there. So they will always leave something from the scene. And either things they bring in or things they take out help in forensic evidence. Now, this is one of the first places. Murder on the Links was published in 1923. And this is one of the first places that Agatha really expresses that in a novel. And this is a quote from local detective Gerard. "The men who carried out this crime were taking no chances. They counted on leaving no traces, but I'll beat them. There's always something, and I mean to find it." And of course, he does find it. And by the way, Agatha's very proud that if you are a strong detective and read carefully, you can solve her mysteries before she reveals the culprit at the end. And this is one of the ways that she does. And by the way, this is the first time we see scene of the crime applied to the location of a crime. And it's a title in one of her chapters. It's also the first time a book uses the word trace or trace evidence. And this is in 1923. So she is ahead of the public game at this time. This is a friend of hers, a member of that crime club that I mentioned, Sir Bernard Spilsbury. He's a forensic pathologist, and like Sir Valentine, he's assigned to a hospital and doing autopsies on any questionable deaths. and he's going to do over 25,000 autopsies in his lifetime. And he will come to the crime meetings and tell about different situations. And one of the things he told about that became a major hit on all of the newspaper was in 1915, Brides in the Bath murders. He had one come in, and this just really baffled him. Here is this healthy young woman who has drowned in a bathtub, and her feet are hanging over the back of the bathtub. How do you get in a position so that you can't get your head up by hanging your feet? Oh, that just didn't seem like a possibility to him. So he kept trying to reenact it, and he did find out that, did you know that there's not a whole lot of flesh around your ankles so that you don't bruise easily around your ankles? So if somebody grabbed you by the ankles and yanked you up, you could be held underwater and not do too much about it. But he could figure out how this had happened, and he's working on it, and he goes to a meeting of other coroners in the London area, and there's this other doctor that has just done an autopsy on another bride, and it's the same thing. She drowned, and her feet are hanging out of the back of the bathtub. How could that be? The two men worked on it a while, and then lo and behold, one other coroner came up and said, you know, I had a bride like that a while back. Oh, really? That's 3 brides that drowned in the bathtub with their feet hanging over the edge. Oh, there's one other little point I probably should tell you. They were all married to the same man. Yeah. So they figure out what he's done. He's grabbed them by the ankles, held them up, and he goes to court and demonstrates how how somebody could drown that way. And of course, the jury convicted the man and sent him off to prison for the rest of his life. Oh, it did take a team of doctors to revive the volunteer that he demonstrated on. He is also going to have a system for collecting evidence that they still use today. And this, remember that murder bag back in her first book? Now, he has developed a crime scene bag of standardized equipment. So every police department has the materials they need when they go out to investigate a crime, to collect fingerprints, to collect any leftover objects, to trace the ballistics on the weapons, and that is a standardized piece of equipment you still hear today. I mean, if you've listened to NCIS or FBI or any of those, they'll say, we've got a body, grab your bag. And that's the one they're talking about. Oh, this is just a little free part because they keep referring to Scotland Yard, and I always wondered, why was it called Scotland Yard? It's not in Scotland, and it's not a yard. But it was. Way back in the 1800s, it was the home for dignitaries that were visiting London on any kind of business from Scotland. And in those days, and even now, you see in London that homes are built kind of around with a park in the middle, and it's gated so that only people that face the park can enjoy it. And that's what this was. There were other countries that had residents in the area, and they were around this park area. So it was Scotland Yard at that period. Now, I bring it up because Scotland Yard's going to have their first fingerprint bureau in 1901, and they're going to be using fingerprints more and more. By the way, did you know fingerprints were back in Bible time? That was the way they sealed documents and things. I didn't know that until recently. And by the way, the other thing that I found out was the headquarters, Scotland Yard, is not like our national FBI or something like that. It's the headquarters of the Metro Police that are policing Greater London's 32 boroughs. So that it is very much a local thing. They, of course, will help other departments, but it is in the London area, those 32 boroughs. Now, go back to the mysterious affair at Styles in 1920, and you're going to see that she is using a technique that they still haven't broken the code on. Hercule Poirot is speaking, and he's telling the group that he's figured out what's happened. And it said, how do you account for the fact that you left the unmistakable impress of your fingerprints? A person can't leave their fingerprints on a permanent object at a scene unless they were present. or their finger was removed somehow and it was present instead. Now, at the time she wrote that, they thought that was really reaching. But it turns out she writes in another book, The Secret Adversary, again about it. And this is 1922 now, this is a few years down the road. And this is what the quote is from one of the characters. The leader of a communist gang tells one of his henchmen, "You will wear gloves with the fingerprints of a notorious housebreaker." Wrote that in 1922. The first time that is mentioned at a conference, at a fingerprint conference, is in 1936, and it's in Buenos Aires. And the police, the statement that is made in that conference, the police describe this as skin thimbles that are slipped over your fingers so that you can leave other people's fingerprints and not your own. So you see how they're beginning to expand the science that they're using to solve mysteries. We're going to look just a little bit at forensic ballistics, the term used to describe the examination of evidence relating to firearms at a crime scene. And there is so much you can learn with this forensic science. You can analyze bullets and cartridge cases that found to determine the type of weapon that fired them, where they were fired from. You can match a bullet or a cartridge casing to a specific weapon. You can help reconstruct a scene by estimating the distance a gun was fired from or calculating the trajectory of the bullets. And we see that over and over as they are working. They know they can identify exactly what gun, and that is going to become important in her books. There is another step that comes up that's going to improve this, and some people even call this a silent detective. It's a comparison microscope. In the 1920s in the United States, Calvin Goddard and Philip Carville improved the comparison microscope. Can you imagine when you're trying to compare two slides and you've got only one scope and you're trying to look at this one and, okay, I remember that now, but I don't remember that now. Can you imagine going back and forth? They put the two scopes together so that you could superimpose them over each other and tell immediately if they matched or if they didn't match. So this is going to change a lot of the forensic science. Now, a couple of months ago, this movie, Death on the Nile, was on TV, and it is Christie's most prolifically scientific mystery in terms of ballistics, and it really had you going if you were paying attention. I'm not going to tell you the ending, but it is a really wealthy young lady beats up with one of her old friends who's really quite poor and has a quite poor boyfriend, and she's traveling with them. Everything's great, hunky-dory, until the young man ditches the poor girl and marries the rich girl. And the poor girl is not very happy about that, so she follows them on their honeymoon. And it gets worse and worse. And the rich girl goes to Hercule, who's on the same boat on the Nile, and said, "Can you do anything to stop her? She's ruining our honeymoon." And he's trying to, but he's not very successful. And the next thing you know, somebody gets shot. Oh my gosh, it's the groom, and he's been shot. And while they're all in the room trying to figure out what's happening, they call and say, "Wait a minute, the bride down here is dead too." And how did that happen? They had a gun that they silenced by wrapping a velvet scarf around it, and they shot her with it, so nobody knew when she was shot. And then it was thrown overboard, and they couldn't find it. And everybody said, "Well, that's because there's only one gun." And Perot said, "No, there's two guns. This is not even the same caliber as the other gun. This doesn't work. And by the way, what about the time of death? And that doesn't fit right if it gives this person an alibi and it doesn't give the other." They go back and forth over and over, but it deals with the size of the bullet, the trajectory, the fact that they cannot find I did not hear the second bullet, or was it the first bullet? They don't know. So you see how she builds and builds on these questions in solving the murder. Now you'll have to go back and watch the movie. The first Jane Marple movie was in 1930, and this is when she really exposes the importance of the time of death and how they can estimate the time of death. It's very important that it be estimated correctly in order for people to have the proper alibis. The only way that they can get an accurate at this time, I'm assuming that there's been some improvement since the 1930s, but at this time, they used ambient temperature, rectal temperature of the body, and weight of the body, and they can estimate the time of death within a window of 5.5 hours. Christie's fictional doctors always adhered to that time frame. They would not allow them to. Now, yes, if somebody smashes your wristwatch when they murder you, you probably have got an accurate time of death. But that doesn't happen that often. So they go with this time of death, and it becomes a major part in solving the murder at the vicarage. Now, people say that Miss Marple was patterned on Agatha Christie's Annie Granny. And Agatha said, absolutely not. Annie Granny is a feisty lady. She was a beloved character, but she does not fit Miss Marple. She said, my characters are built of many different people that I contribute parts, pieces to. By the way, you probably want to know, why did they call her Annie Granny? Agatha's father married the niece of his stepmother, his American father's English second wife. It's even more confusing than that. Her grandmother was widowed with a house full of kids, one girl and the rest boys. When Agatha's father married the niece of his stepmother, when he married her, they adopted that one girl. And so Agatha's mother was raised by her aunt, Annie Granny. And it just turns out that that boy that he had had by his first wife who had died was her husband. So for Agatha, her mother's mother, aunt, was her Annie, and on her father's side, Granny. If you didn't understand that, that's okay. I can print it out and you can try to follow it because it's really confusing. But Annie Granny is what she was called the rest of her life. I'm going to look just a minute at a couple of the characters that were in her books that were so important in her legacy. This is, of course, Angela Lansbury in The Mirror Cracked. And amazingly enough, Agatha was not that thrilled about Angela in this movie. This is not her favorite. She didn't dislike her. It just wasn't her favorite Miss Marple. And yes, that is Rock Hudson in the back there. It's amazing the characters you get. But in this particular story, in the original book that the movie is based on, there is a chapter that is called Murder, She Said. I wonder where they got the title of that TV series we all loved. The Miss Joan Hickson was the Miss Marple that Agatha loved, and she would play that role from 1984 to 1992, and she was much more appropriate age-wise at that time than Angela had been in the other one. But this Miss Hickson embodied a lot of the description that you would see. Now, this just amazes me. When World War II broke out, her books were very popular. She had people that loved the Perrault novels and the Miss Marple novels. And she did not want anything to happen that would prevent them from finding out how their lives ended, how their stories resolved. So at the beginning of World War II, she's living in London, volunteering as a pharmacist, and she is in an area that's being bombed regularly. So she sits down and writes, at the beginning of World War II, Curtains, the final novel in the Perrault series. It is not published till 1975, just before a few years before her death. Likewise, the final Jane Marple was written at the beginning of World War II, and it was published in 76, and it was called Sleeping Murder. Those were locked up for decades. So if anything happened to her, there was closure for all of us that loved her books. Now, the Mousetrap, I mentioned it was the longest running, and it had been very successful. But there's some issues that are coming up about her successes. Do you see, if you die in England with a lot of wealth, a lot of it goes to the government. And she didn't mind paying her share, she just didn't want to give it all away. And so she has started in 52 diversing herself of some of this wealth. And the Mousetrap is one she's going to give to her grandson, and he will get the royalties for it the rest of his life. She had no idea it would run all those years. She had no idea it was going to make so much money. There were other things, either books or stories or plays, that she would give to different charities that have turned out to be incredibly important to their finances over the years. So she is realizing and trying to make sure that her money is given where she wants it to be, but she also realizes that she's got to do something more than that. Here she is with that grandson, Matthew, pictured in 1956. And as he is getting older and her daughter's getting older, their relationship is very, very positive. So what she does is she sets up an organization called Agatha Christie Limited. It holds the copyrights to all of her books and things. 33% of that is held by her family. Legally, that was the most she could give without taking the charitable value out. But 33%. When she died, Max was head of the company a little while, but basically her daughter took over, and then her son, and now her grandson has taken over. And that's why we have all those short stories and things that are on PBS, because she set up an organization that could control the use of her materials. And by the way, when she died, they found hundreds and hundreds of notebooks of ideas for books, ideas for stories. Some of them were very complete. Some of them were just names that would be good in a story. So there is a ton of material out there for us to have new ideas. And at the time of her death, Max was devastated. He did remarry 2 years after her death, and he lived about 2 years after that marriage before he passed away. But she died in the mid-70s and left quite a legacy for us. And if you haven't started reading her books, you've got a lot of books ahead. And by the way, they print them in different names in different countries. So it's hard to know which ones you've already read sometime. I just want to mention that because I bought a few that I'd already read. I hope that you learned something about how
Thank you, Mary. Always fun and informative. And she's the mistress of, maybe I forgot to mention.
Oh.
You saw how often she did that. And we went, yeah, oh, okay. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Now, next week, the consumer watchdog, Dave Lieber from the Dallas Morning News, who loves to write biographies, has got a brand new one out just this spring, Dandy Don Meredith, the First Cowboy. So join us next week for Dave Lieber and Don Meredith.